Spring 1945. The war in Europe is ending, but the land lies in ruins. The roads of Western Germany are filled with convoys, olive-drab trucks grinding through the wreckage of once proud cities. The air smells of diesel, ash, and wet brick. On both sides of the road, German civilians stand silently, their faces pale and hollow from months of hunger. Children clutch their mothers' hands, staring in disbelief. The trucks don't carry soldiers or shells. They carry food, crates of meat, flour, sugar, and bottles capped with red labels that glint in the cold sunlight. Coca-Cola. Some of the drivers wave as they pass, their sleeves rolled up, cigarettes dangling from their mouths. Behind them, parked near a shattered church, a group of American GIs have set up a makeshift grill. The sizzle of meat cuts through the silence, the unmistakable sound of hamburgers frying in a field still littered with debris. To the onlookers, it's incomprehensible. Only days ago, these same roads carried retreating Wehrmacht troops and burned-out tanks. Now the conquerors are eating fresh bread and drinking soda, laughing in the shadow of a war that has taken everything from them. The Americans have not just brought victory, they've brought their way of life, transition. To understand how Coca-Cola, hamburgers, and Allied convoys became symbols of a new kind of power in post-war Europe, we must first look at the system that made it all possible, the greatest supply network in modern military history. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins, bridges twisted into the rivers below, and rail lines torn apart by years of relentless bombing. Across the smoldering heart of Europe, Allied forces advanced from every direction, Americans and British from the west, Soviets from the east. What had once been the industrial core of the Third Reich was now a graveyard of concrete and smoke. Yet amid the destruction, something astonishing unfolded behind the front lines. An American logistical machine so vast, so efficient, that it could not only sustain an army but also deliver comfort, taste, and familiarity thousands of miles from home. To understand how the Allies reached this point, we must return to the foundations of the war effort itself. The United States had mobilized not only soldiers but an entire nation. Factories that once built cars, radios, and refrigerators were retooled to produce tanks, jeeps, and bombers. But it wasn't just weapons that defined American military power. It was supply. By 1944, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had built an unprecedented global network, stretching from American ports to the beaches of Normandy and beyond. Every bullet, bandage, and can of beans followed a path carefully orchestrated by planners who understood that victory was not just fought on battlefields, but sustained by logistics. One of the most critical arteries of this system was the Red Ball Express, a vast convoy network established in August 1944 after the breakout from Normandy. Thousands of trucks, manned primarily by African-American drivers, raced supplies from the beaches of France to the rapidly advancing front lines. Day and night they thundered down hastily marked roads, carrying everything from fuel and ammunition to cigarettes and candy. Their efficiency kept the Allied armies alive and moving, feeding men and machines across a continent shattered by war. This logistical rhythm, constant, relentless, would later make it possible to deliver not just essentials, but luxuries to troops deep in enemy territory. By late 1944, as the Allies crossed into Germany, the U.S. supply system had become a symbol of abundance. In stark contrast to the Axis powers, whose resources had withered under blockade and bombing, the American military operated with almost unimaginable reach. While German soldiers struggled with thin rations of black bread and watery soup, GIs were served meat, coffee, sugar, and fruit preserves. They received candy bars and cigarettes by the crate. It wasn't merely sustenance, it was morale, a reminder of home. And nowhere was that sense of familiarity more visible than in the presence of Coca-Cola. Before the war, Coca-Cola had already established bottling plants in several European countries, including Germany itself. But when war broke out, production on the continent collapsed under Allied embargoes and material shortages. Ironically, within Nazi Germany, the local branch of Coca-Cola adapted by creating a substitute beverage made from apple fiber and whey. It was called Fanta. Yet, even as Fanta filled bottles in wartime Germany, the real Coca-Cola was making its way into Europe once more, carried in steel drums, wooden crates, and later, its own bottling plants built by the U.S. Army to serve soldiers. By 1943, The Coca-Cola company had entered into a formal agreement with the U.S. War Department, promising that every American soldier, wherever he served, would have access to a bottle of Coke for 5 cents. The company sent mobile bottling units across the Atlantic, staffed by civilian technical observers, who followed the armies from North Africa to France. The U.S. military built nearly 60 bottling plants by war's end, in Britain, Italy, North Africa, and finally in newly liberated territories of France and Germany. Each plant was more than a factory. It was a statement of identity. For the American soldier, drinking Coke wasn't just refreshment. It was a ritual of home, a connection to the life he had left behind. Meanwhile, German civilians were experiencing an entirely different reality. By 1944, food shortages were severe. Cities like Cologne and Hamburg were reduced to rubble, and civilians survived on meager rations, powdered potatoes, ersatz coffee, thin soups. Malnutrition was widespread. When the Allies finally broke through, they found entire regions starving, dependent on whatever the occupying armies could provide. For those civilians, the sight of convoys delivering not just bread or canned meat but hamburgers and soft drinks was nothing short of surreal. The contrast was not accidental. American planners understood the psychological power of plenty, supplying soldiers with comfort food, clean uniforms, and recognizable products served a dual purpose: maintaining morale among troops and projecting the image of an industrial superpower capable of abundance even amid chaos. In the words of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the war was won as much by logistics as by weapons. Every truckload of rations was an extension of that truth. By the time American convoys rolled into German towns in April 1945, they represented a world that most civilians had never imagined. U.S. supply trains carried canned ham, powdered eggs, butter, chocolate, coffee, and Coca-Cola in quantities that dwarfed the rations of any army in history. Soldiers fried hamburgers on portable griddles beside their jeeps, shared gum with local children, and traded chocolate for trinkets or information. For German civilians, it was not just food, it was revelation. At the heart of this abundance was a system built on precision and scale. From the ports of Antwerp and Le Havre, supplies flowed in a constant stream toward the front. The Quartermaster Corps managed everything: warehousing, refrigeration, transport, ensuring that nothing spoiled, nothing stopped. When troops entered Germany, the supply lines followed. Within weeks of occupation, the same infrastructure that had fueled the Allied advance began sustaining an army of occupation. Military mess halls, mobile kitchens, and post exchanges, PXs, sprang up across the Rhineland, stocked with everything from Spam to Hershey bars. For the soldiers, it meant normalcy amid the ruins. For the civilians, it was an introduction to something entirely foreign: the culture of convenience, industrial food, and mass production that defined America. But behind the smell of frying meat and the fizz of soda lay something larger. The Allies weren't just feeding their troops. They were feeding an idea: that democracy, prosperity, and plenty could triumph over the ruins of dictatorship. Every hamburger served and every Coca-Cola bottle opened in occupied Germany carried a message, one that would echo long after the war ended: transition. And as the convoys moved deeper into Germany, those symbols of plenty began to take on new meaning, for the soldiers who consumed them and the civilians who watched. What began as supply soon became spectacle, and what was once war transformed into a cultural invasion unlike anything Europe had seen before. In the months following Germany's surrender, the war seemed to recede, but its consequences lingered in every corner of Europe. The American presence was no longer defined by combat, but by occupation and sustenance. Across the defeated nation, Allied convoys continued to roll, their cargo no longer ammunition or fuel but food, equipment, and comfort. For the first time in years, the roads carried not destruction but survival. Yet the supplies that flowed from the depots of the U.S. Army carried something more potent than nourishment. They carried culture, the flavor of America itself. To the exhausted, hungry civilians of post-war Germany, the taste of American food was almost otherworldly. For many, it was the first time they had seen white bread, real meat, or sugar in half a decade. And to the occupying soldiers, those same items, hamburgers, chocolate bars, and Coca-Cola, became the daily ritual that reminded them of what they had fought for. The scene repeated itself across the occupied zones. In Cologne, the smell of grilled meat drifted through shattered streets as American mess units set up portable kitchens near the Rhine. In Frankfurt, soldiers leaned against jeeps, drinking cold bottles of Coca-Cola as children gathered to watch, eyes wide with disbelief. The GIs would sometimes offer a stick of gum or a sip of soda to a curious onlooker, small gestures that carried the weight of an entire cultural divide. For the Germans, the sight was almost surreal. Years of propaganda had painted the Americans as crude and materialistic, their society as decadent. Yet here they were, relaxed, confident, generous, and astonishingly well-fed. The difference was not just economic, it was spiritual. The American soldier represented a kind of abundance that seemed to contradict everything Germany had endured. He embodied a nation that had not only won the war, but had done so without losing its appetite for comfort, laughter, and life. Behind that image, however, was one of the most sophisticated logistical networks ever constructed. By 1945, the U.S. Army's supply apparatus spanned continents, with depots in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands feeding the occupation forces inside Germany. At its height, the network delivered nearly 500,000 tons of supplies per month, enough to feed, clothe, and equip millions of men. Everything was accounted for, from uniforms to toothbrushes, from typewriters to ice cream mix. And in that precision lay the secret of American dominance. Even the smallest comforts were deliberate. Coca-Cola's wartime partnership with the U.S. military ensured that bottling plants were established wherever troops went. Each new plant required sugar, glass, carbon dioxide, and machinery, all transported by the same convoys that carried rations and ammunition. What began as a morale initiative quickly became a global enterprise. By war's end, Coca-Cola had built more than 60 bottling facilities overseas, many of which would remain in operation long after peace returned. The drink's symbolic power was immediate. To American troops, Coca-Cola meant home, baseball games, jukeboxes, hot summers, and peacetime. To the Germans, it represented something larger, the overwhelming material and industrial capacity of the United States. A single bottle, chilled in an ice chest beside a tank, carried the weight of an empire. The hamburger told a similar story. Portable griddles and field stoves turned canned meat and flour into something more familiar, the archetypal American meal. Soldiers improvised with what they had: Spam patties pressed between slices of army bread, onions fried in lard, and a bit of mustard if supplies allowed. It wasn't the diner experience of home, but it was close enough to trigger memories of drive-ins and picnics, of a life untouched by war. For civilians, the smell alone was intoxicating. Hunger has a way of sharpening the senses, and the aroma of grilled meat amid the ruins of a city was almost unbearable. Some Germans, desperate and curious, approached cautiously, trading trinkets or labor for a meal. Others watched silently, torn between resentment and fascination. For a generation raised under scarcity, the hamburger was more than food. It was proof of defeat, and at the same time, a glimpse of a different future. To the U.S. Army, such moments mattered. The Office of War Information and Military Leadership understood that the occupation was not only a matter of security, but of influence. Food, entertainment, and consumer goods became subtle instruments of diplomacy. Where artillery had once spoken, now it was chewing gum, radio music, and Coca-Cola. American culture began to seep into everyday German life, carried by convoys, PX stores, and the easy camaraderie of GIs stationed among the ruins. Even as soldiers fraternized with civilians, officially discouraged, but quietly common, the exchange of small luxuries became a bridge. A cigarette offered, a chocolate bar shared, a Coke bottle passed around. Each gesture carried meaning, the conqueror showing kindness, the defeated seeing humanity in the uniform. Slowly, suspicion gave way to curiosity. In this way, the American army achieved something propaganda never could. It humanized victory. Meanwhile, the economic disparity was impossible to ignore. Germany's infrastructure lay in tatters. Railways were broken, farmland flooded, factories dismantled. In contrast, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of everything. Convoys rolled in daily from Antwerp and Le Havre, bringing gasoline, tinned food, and the comforts of modern life. It was as if the United States had an entire continent's worth of resources to spare. That abundance was not just the result of wealth, but of organization. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, in partnership with private industry, had turned production into a science. Standardized packaging, interchangeable containers, and precise schedules ensured that supplies never stopped flowing. This same system that delivered bombs to the front lines also delivered hamburgers to the rear. In doing so, it revealed the central truth of America's wartime success, its ability to turn industry into culture. While the Germans tried to rebuild with the little they had, American bases flourished. Soldiers played baseball in open lots, listened to swing records on portable phonographs, and sipped soda from glass bottles beneath the same sky that had once been filled with bombers. To many civilians, it was baffling. How could the same army that had unleashed so much destruction now appear so casual, so comfortable, so modern? But behind the paradox lay a deeper shift. The war had proven that power was not only measured in military might, but in production, distribution, and the ability to sustain comfort under pressure. America had not only outfought its enemies, it had outproduced and outfed them. The hamburger and Coca-Cola, mundane as they seemed, became symbols of that new order. The influence was contagious. Children who had once been taught to idolize the Führer now watched American soldiers with fascination. They mimicked their slang, collected ration tins, and learned to say okay. Civilians scavenged discarded Coke bottles and used them as water containers, or kept them as relics. In taverns and homes, people whispered about the American way, a phrase that was beginning to carry a new meaning in occupied Europe. For the Allies, especially the Americans, this cultural transmission was as strategic as any military operation. Feeding the defeated meant pacifying them. Providing small comforts meant reducing resentment. But it also laid the groundwork for something far greater, the transformation of Germany from enemy to ally. And as Coca-Cola reopened its first bottling plant in Essen under U.S. oversight in 1946, the symbol of American abundance became permanently rooted in German soil. The same factories that had once served soldiers now supplied civilians, and with every bottle filled and every hamburger sold in the following years, the line between occupation and influence blurred a little more. Transition. The story of how hamburgers and Coca-Cola entered a war-torn Germany is one of logistics, psychology, and power, but its most striking chapter came in the moment of contact. When convoys rolled through shattered cities and soldiers met civilians face to face, it wasn't just food being exchanged. It was an entire way of life. March 1945. The Rhine River, the last great natural barrier of the Reich, was no longer a line of defense. The Allies had crossed it, and the Third Reich was collapsing from within. But as tanks rumbled east and the smoke of battle drifted toward Berlin, something else began to fill the roads of Western Germany. Convoys. Endless convoys. They came in the thousands. Olive-drab GMC trucks, trailers stacked high with crates stamped U.S. Army. Inside those wooden boxes lay not just supplies but symbols of a new kind of power. Flour, canned beef, chewing gum, cigarettes, and astonishingly bottles of Coca-Cola packed in straw. To the civilians who emerged from basements and bomb shelters, it was surreal. The conquerors did not come looting or burning. They came feeding. In Cologne, the sound of gunfire faded into the hum of engines. German soldiers had vanished or surrendered. What remained were civilians, gaunt, hollow-eyed, clutching whatever possessions they still had. The streets were rubble, the air thick with dust and silence. Then from the edge of the city came the sound of laughter. An American field kitchen had been set up beside a bombed-out tram stop. GIs in rolled-up sleeves flipped patties on a steel griddle, the scent of frying meat drifting through the ruins. The hamburgers were made from army rations, ground beef from tinned supplies, cooked fast, topped with onions, and served on white bread from the latest shipment. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, filling, and unmistakably American. Nearby, other soldiers unpacked Coca-Cola crates, the bottles clinking as they hit the rough wooden tables. They popped the caps, the hiss of carbonation cutting through the quiet like a strange new sound of peace. The soldiers passed them around, trading jokes, pouring some over ice chipped from melted snow. A few curious German children crept closer, drawn by the smell and the laughter. One soldier, barely older than 20, crouched down and handed a bottle to a little boy. The boy hesitated, then drank. His eyes widened as the bubbles hit his tongue. That moment, simple, fleeting, and true, became a kind of turning point not just in the occupation, but in history itself. The American army had brought with it not only freedom from a dictatorship, but a culture of abundance that was completely alien to Europe after 6 years of deprivation. The same logistics system that had flattened the Nazi war machine was now feeding millions, and in doing so it reshaped the meaning of victory. In Frankfurt, soldiers set up recreation tents beside the main river. The city had been bombed to ashes, but on the riverbank a jukebox played Glenn Miller records. The smell of hamburgers and fried potatoes mixed with the scent of wet stone and rubble. Some civilians gathered at a distance, watching as soldiers danced with nurses or shared sandwiches and soda at makeshift tables. For the first time in years, music played openly in a German city, and it was American. In Hamburg, things unfolded on an even larger scale. The port that had once built U-boats and housed the Kriegsmarine now served as an unloading point for Allied cargo ships. Each day, tons of supplies arrived: powdered milk, Spam, flour, coffee, and Coca-Cola syrup. The syrup was mixed with carbonated water on site at the first post-war bottling facility, guarded by MPs, staffed by technicians in U.S. uniforms. The soldiers who worked there didn't think much of it, but for the locals who glimpsed the activity, it was extraordinary. In a city still rationing potatoes, they saw an army manufacturing soft drinks. It was more than irony. It was the projection of power through normalcy. America wasn't rebuilding through speeches or leaflets. It was rebuilding through appetite, proving with every bottle and every burger that its way of life had triumphed. But there was another layer to it, one of deep psychological dissonance. For many German civilians, the sight of their occupiers eating and laughing amid ruins stirred conflicting emotions: envy, resentment, relief, even fascination. They had been told that the Allies would destroy them. Instead, they watched as soldiers shared food with their children. It was impossible to hate an enemy who offered chocolate and Coca-Cola. And that was precisely the point. Across the American-occupied zones, local bakers and butchers were soon recruited to assist the military kitchens. German workers helped unload supply trucks, learning new methods of packaging and preservation in the process. American rations became part of the German diet: canned ham, tinned fruit, and later, reconstituted milk from the Marshall Plan's shipments. Small businesses, often run by widows or displaced families, sprang up selling whatever surplus they could find. A new kind of economy emerged, fueled by trade with the very army that had defeated them. In the black markets of Frankfurt and Munich, Coca-Cola bottles became currency. Empty ones were washed and refilled with water or homemade syrups. Children collected caps as souvenirs. U.S. mess halls even became informal meeting places where locals traded labor or information for food. And in the midst of this quiet exchange, a transformation began. The Germans no longer saw the Americans as foreign conquerors. They saw them as representatives of something modern, efficient, and, perhaps most surprisingly, humane. For the soldiers, too, these encounters left a lasting mark. Many of them had never been to Europe before. They had expected hostility or hatred. What they found instead was gratitude, curiosity, and need. Feeding the hungry, even in small gestures, gave meaning to their victory. A hamburger shared beside a burned-out train station carried more emotional weight than a medal or commendation. It was a moment of human contact in a world that had almost forgotten what that felt like. By late 1945, Coca-Cola had become so integrated into the occupation zones that new bottling lines were planned for Munich, Bremen, and Stuttgart. The company sent technicians, many of them veterans, to restore facilities and train German workers. These plants would not only serve Allied soldiers but eventually civilians as well. Within a few years, Coca-Cola signs began to appear in shop windows and railway kiosks, marking the quiet return of commerce to a defeated nation. Meanwhile, the hamburgers' journey took a similar path. What began as a field meal soon became a local curiosity. Street vendors near American bases began selling improvised versions, using whatever meat and bread they could find. For a generation of Germans who had known only ration cards and turnip stew, the taste of fried meat and bread became synonymous with recovery. It was in these small exchanges, in the food, drink, and the easy laughter of foreign soldiers, that America's post-war influence took root. While the Soviet Union built walls and imposed control, the Americans built cafeterias and airlifted chocolate. Their empire was one of consumption, not conquest. And though few realized it at the time, the moment when a German boy first tasted Coca-Cola or saw a soldier flip a hamburger on a makeshift grill was more than an anecdote. It was the beginning of a cultural revolution. The war had ended with surrender. But peace, as it turned out, would be won with taste, familiarity, and comfort. Transition. The guns had gone silent, but the convoys never stopped. What followed next was not destruction, but rebuilding, a new battle for hearts and minds, fought with the same tools that had fed the American army and now promised to feed an entire continent. When the war finally ended, Europe stood in ruins, but for the United States, the true work had only just begun. The Allied occupation of Germany was not simply about enforcing surrender. It was about reconstruction, rebuilding not only cities but societies. In that mission, the convoys that once carried rations and fuel took on a new role. They became lifelines, delivering the physical and psychological foundation of what would become a new Europe. The American military presence across Western Germany was immense. By mid-1945, more than 2.5 million U.S. soldiers were stationed across the continent, living in requisitioned homes, barracks, and camps. Their supply chains, that perfected during the war, continued to function with unmatched efficiency. Warehouses that had once stored ammunition now held flour, butter, coffee, and sugar. The same quartermaster corps that had sustained an army through combat now sustained an entire population through the peace. For German civilians, the transformation was overwhelming. Only months earlier, the sound of trucks meant evacuation or air raids. Now it meant food. American convoys rolled into towns bringing sacks of flour marked USA, tins of meat, powdered milk, and crates of Coca-Cola. To a people worn thin by hunger and fear, it was a sight that bordered on miraculous. In some regions, children began to associate the rumble of American engines with the scent of bread. The humanitarian dimension of occupation quickly merged with symbolism. Every act of feeding was also an act of influence. American GIs were no longer just soldiers. They were emissaries of a culture rooted in abundance. Rations became a form of diplomacy, and food a language of reassurance. Where totalitarianism had ruled through fear, democracy arrived with a full stomach. In the months following surrender, American logistical power was redirected to humanitarian efforts under what became known as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. Working alongside Allied forces, it provided food, medicine, and reconstruction materials across the continent. German civilians, once enemies, now stood in bread lines marked with the same insignia as the U.S. Army. And in those lines, amid fatigue and disbelief, something began to change. Trust. Food distribution centers, run jointly by Allied soldiers and local administrators, became gathering places. The efficiency of the American system impressed even the defeated Germans. Lines moved quickly, portions were measured precisely, and no one was turned away. For many, it was their first real encounter with American order, structured, disciplined, and humane. Even small details mattered. The cleanliness of mess halls, the care with which food was served, the fact that everyone, soldier or civilian, waited their turn. And behind those acts of charity was a deeper strategy. Washington understood that the next great battle would not be fought with weapons but with ideas. A starving Germany could fall easily to resentment or extremism. A fed Germany, by contrast, could become a partner. Thus, food became the first step toward the political and cultural realignment that would define post-war Europe. As the months passed, the physical signs of American influence multiplied. Coca-Cola bottling plants reopened under military supervision in Essen, Bremen, and Munich. These plants, initially created to serve troops, soon began selling to civilians. By 1947, Coca-Cola was once again being advertised in Germany. Its familiar script now printed beside phrases like "Drink Coca-Cola." Drink Coca-Cola. The product that had once followed soldiers into battle was now following them into peace. In taverns and cafes that survived the bombings, the reappearance of Coca-Cola was more than a commercial event. It was emotional. To the German youth, it represented a connection to a modern, victorious world. To older generations, it was a reminder of how far they had fallen. Either way, the drink symbolized the future. At the same time, the hamburger, that quintessential American meal, began making its quiet entrance into European life. In occupation zones, American PX and canteens served them regularly. Local cooks employed by the army learned to prepare them with military precision. Some took the recipes home, recreating them with whatever ingredients they could find. In Frankfurt and Munich, small stands began selling improvised versions to passers-by. It was not yet a commercial industry, but the idea had taken root. These small cultural shifts would soon feed into a larger economic transformation. In 1948, as the Cold War deepened and Europe's recovery became a geopolitical priority, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars in aid poured into Western Europe, rebuilding factories, roads, and railways, and with them, the foundations of a consumer economy. American companies were encouraged to invest, distribute, and produce locally. Coca-Cola expanded operations, establishing partnerships that would last decades. By the early 1950s, its red logo, once a novelty in occupied cities, became a familiar sight across Western Europe. For the Germans, the memory of those first post-war years remained vivid. Many recalled the first Coca-Cola they ever tasted, or the first American meal they shared. For a generation that had grown up under rationing and fear, these experiences shaped their perception of the United States far more than any political speech could. They did not just see America as the victor, they saw it as a land of plenty, a place where the everyday luxuries of food, comfort, and leisure were woven into national identity. But this transformation was not without tension. Some older Germans resented the growing influence of American culture. They viewed the imported goods, music, and food as a kind of soft invasion, a replacement of heritage with consumerism. Yet even among skeptics, the allure of abundance was undeniable. The ration cards grew thinner, the markets fuller, and the taste of hunger began to fade. Meanwhile, on the American side, the occupation years left a lasting mark on soldiers. Many GIs returned home carrying stories of starving civilians and grateful children. They remembered the disbelief on German faces when offered chocolate or soda, and the strange feeling of being both conqueror and caretaker. For them, victory was no longer about flags or parades. It was about rebuilding, and in that process they discovered a new kind of power. The cultural consequences would echo across decades. When rock and roll, Hollywood films, and consumer goods later swept across Europe, they followed the same path as those early convoys. Coca-Cola trucks that once supplied GIs would soon deliver to civilian stores. American diners opened in Frankfurt and Berlin, blending nostalgia and novelty. The hamburger, once a ration improvised in wartime, became a staple of the new European palate. And yet, for all its optimism, the memory of that first contact, the moment when German civilians watched Allied soldiers eat hamburgers beside shattered buildings, never lost its strangeness. It captured in one image the turning of an era, the end of a war fought by starvation and steel, and the beginning of a peace built through comfort and consumption. By the early 1950s, West Germany had not only recovered but had become one of Europe's fastest-growing economies. American goods flooded markets from refrigerators to soft drinks. The very convoys that had once represented occupation now symbolized partnership. The same trucks that had crossed Germany under the command of the U.S. Army were now operated by German companies distributing American brands. And through it all, the memory of Coca-Cola and hamburgers endured. To some, they were reminders of defeat. To others, they were tokens of hope. But to history, they became something larger, the earliest signs of a new world order taking shape, one defined not by conquest but by culture, transition. The guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, but the struggle to define peace had only begun. And in that struggle, America's greatest weapon was no longer the tank or the bomber. It was the promise of a full meal and a cold drink. By the time the 1950s arrived, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The craters were filled, the rubble cleared, and in their place stood cafes, shops, and cinemas once more. The ghosts of war still lingered, in memory and scars and silence, but the rhythm of life had returned. In the American sector, soldiers no longer patrolled ruins. They sat at diner-style counters in base canteens, sipping Coca-Cola and eating hamburgers while German workers served them. What had once been a sign of occupation had become a ritual of normalcy. Yet beneath this ordinary picture lay something far greater, a quiet revolution in influence. The American army had brought more than victory over tyranny. It had brought an idea of power built on generosity. Soldiers who handed chocolate to children or shared Coke bottles with curious locals were not diplomats or politicians, yet their small gestures carried the weight of a nation whose strength came not only from weapons, but from abundance. The hamburger and the Coke bottle were never meant to be symbols of empire, yet they became exactly that. Icons of a civilization defined by its ability to create, distribute, and share comfort on a massive scale. In a Europe once scarred by hunger and ruin, that comfort was impossible to resist. The old order had been built on obedience, sacrifice, and scarcity. The new one promised freedom, individuality, and plenty. Historians often measure victory in borders redrawn or treaties signed, but some victories arrive in quieter ways, in the hiss of a soda bottle opening on a spring afternoon, or the scent of meat cooking, where once there had been only smoke and ash. Those simple human moments carried a message no speech could match, that peace could be tasted. And so, in the ruins of war, the hamburger and Coca-Cola did what bombs could not. They rebuilt belief. Not in conquest but in possibility, not in fear but in familiarity. From the rubble of the old world rose a new one, not forged in fire but sustained by comfort, laughter, and the quiet miracle of an ordinary meal.